Hi, this is the progressive level video on the opposition, and a quick review of why we use the opposition and what it can do for us. And at the end I'll tell you a funny story about what the opposition cannot do for us. So first of all, we use the opposition in order to invade our opponent's territory. By gaining the opposition, we push their king one way or the other. We're going to outflank them. And if he goes over to the right, then we gain ground, we get closer to their side, and we're able to capture that pawn and then either promote it or use it as bait and go take the other pawn on the other side. We also use the opposition simply as a way to promote a pawn. So if we just have that one pawn, we get the opposition and then we gain ground and get to the golden square. But we also use it defensively as well. Our king comes in, keeps our opponent's king out, holding the hands up, making sure the black king can't invade our territory. Sometimes we have to use a reserve tempo. If our opponent has gained the opposition, but we have a move that we can waste, this is called reserve tempo. Here it's simply pawn to h3, and now it's black's turn. They're in Jettison, they have to move away, and our king invades their territory. Now, with reserve tempo, sometimes you have to calculate if it's going to be a one-pawn push or a two-pawn push. 2 squares or 1. Here, we'll go h3, and now after black plays h5, we can play h4, and they're in Jettison. When you get your king to the 6th rank ahead of your pawn, it doesn't matter if you have the opposition or not. And I know this seems funny because I keep telling you opposition, opposition, opposition. But here, let's say first of all that it's white's turn in this position. Well, we simply win with the opposition and getting to the golden square, that square where we protect a pawn on its last 3 moves. But if it's black's turn and they gain the opposition, now by pushing the pawn we kind of gain it back so that we can use what's called the squeeze maneuver. And the king comes over, we squeeze him out, black's in Jettison, they wish it weren't their move. They're going to have to move the king, then after he moves out of the way we get to the golden square and can promote the pawn. Now in this position, we see this important idea that after you gain the opposition, you can't just advance your king and gain ground because the black king can come straight down and take your pawn. Instead, you gain the opposition again on the file that your pawn is on. Then you can advance and tear their position and get to the golden square. Now, in that position, you might notice at the start, our king is right next to our pawn, and we move straight up to get the opposition. So this position is really not that much different. Just both kings have been moved over 2 files. And so hopefully you'll notice that that means if we go to f5, big mistake. Black gets a draw with the opposition, the defensive opposition. So we go to g5, and then we'll just scoot over. Once we get in front of our pawn, now we can gain ground and win the game. We can use a tool called the diagonal opposition, which is really just outflanking our opponent. We're heading towards that golden square on e7, and if the king stops us from going up in that direction, now we can get the direct opposition and win that way. And here we see a position that's going to use what we just learned, this idea that if we move it directly towards the pawn, then black plays king e8, and that's a draw. But if we go to f6, opposition, opposition, and now we squeeze them out, we can use that squeeze maneuver to win the game. In this case, you probably can calculate that moving the king straight up is not going to work. You have to get your king in front of your pawn. And since the black king is on the 8th rank, he can quickly get to the 6th rank, except he can't get to the king side quickly. He's way over on b8. And so we're going to run our king to the king side underneath the pawn. I call that subway. And then we can get in front of our pawn and gain the opposition. In this one, we see that moving your king to the natural looking square e6, which is closer to the action, is just not right. Black would gain the opposition and draw the game. So instead we step away from the pawns to get the opposition. And now it's a squeeze maneuver, a little different kind of squeeze maneuver, where we squeeze the king away from not guarding the promotion square, but from guarding that pawn on c7. Now let's talk about jettison. A jettison is when you give away a pawn in order to gain something in return. In this one, we're going to give away the pawn to get the opposition. In this next one, we're going to give away a pawn as a reserve tempo so that we can now push this pawn and use our reserve tempo, our saved up move, to get the opposition. The black king goes one way, and eventually we can gain ground and go, for example, and just take this pawn over here. In this defensive jettison, we are going to give away that front A pawn and then push the second one. And now just keep our hands up and keep that black king away from our position. And now if we think we're pretty tricky when we play king f1, the black king will take the pawn and then we'll move up to f2 and think, yay, we got the opposition. But then black has a reserve tempo. They can push and we're lost. So instead we jettison the pawn so that our opponent won't have an opportunity to have a reserve tempo. And then we get the opposition here, and that's a draw for white. Now this idea is called the distant opposition, and we are going to move, there's an odd number of squares between us, 3 squares. In a direct opposition there's 1 square between, but a distant opposition is 3 or 5 squares in between the kings. Now that black king, he can't move on top of his pawn, so he has to come in. That allows us to get the direct opposition and get the draw against him. And here we're going to have to set it up. If we try for the distant opposition right away, then the king comes in. We get it again by going to e2. He captures the pawn. We get the opposition, and now he can waste a move on e5. So instead we jettison the pawn, and now we get the opposition against him when he comes in. Last position before my funny story. Just a quick reminder, if you get your king in front of that pawn that's on the 6th rank, not letting their king get next to it, then you're good to go. You just stay in front of the pawn until they do come in. Always stay in front of the pawn until the king comes in, then stay in front of the king, getting the opposition for the draw. Now, funny story, one of my students watched my lesson Friday night about the opposition. The next day was a tournament. He came out of the tournament room and he says, Coach Jay, I used the opposition, but I still lost. And I was like, what? Oh my goodness, you know, what happened? I was eager to see what the mistake was. Well, what I failed to explain was the opposition was good for king and pawn in games, not all situations. So here was the position on the board when my student played king to g4, gaining the opposition. But unfortunately, he's losing by a rook, a knight, a bishop, and a pawn. And of course, he went on to lose the game. So opposition is a wonderful tool, but it's not magical. All right, that's it for the progressive level opposition. I'll check you later.